Your little dirt patch was an eyesore, Sergeant, a blight on this community's aesthetic standards. I was just improving the soil's mineral content. Karen, the self-appointed empress of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association, stood on the edge of my property line, her arms crossed over a voluminous floral print muumuu that did little to conceal her plus-size frame. A smug, self-satisfied smirk was painted across her face, a grotesque counterpoint to the scene of devastation she was surveying. My garden, my sanctuary, was a withered brown graveyard. The vibrant green of the tomato vines, the deep purple of the eggplants, the cheerful yellow of the squash blossoms, all gone. In their place was a sickly, scorched earth, dusted with a familiar white crystalline powder that glinted cruelly in the morning sun. It was rock salt, gallons of it, by the look of it, poured with malicious intent over every single one of my raised beds. This wasn't just a garden. This was 6 months of backbreaking labor, of sourcing heirloom seeds, of building the beds from reclaimed cedar with the same precision I'd once used to assemble my rifle. It was my therapy, the one place where the ghosts of Afghanistan grew quiet, replaced by the simple, honest work of coaxing life from the soil. It was also the source of nearly a third of the produce for my small farm-to-table stand, a business I started to keep myself grounded in the civilian world. She hadn't just killed my plants, she had salted the very earth of my livelihood and my peace. The financial loss was immediate and staggering, thousands of dollars in lost crops and future earnings. But the violation cut far deeper. She had declared war on my quiet corner of the world, and she was gloating about it. This is the kind of nightmare you never expect when you buy a home. If you're reading this, I'm sure some of you have your own stories of HOA tyrants and power-tripping neighbors. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what your own HOA nightmare story is. You are not alone, and believe me, there is always a way to fight back. Now let me tell you how I took this woman's smug satisfaction and turned it into a $60,000 criminal restitution order that cost her everything she thought her power protected. The road to this confrontation had been paved with petty notices and escalating absurdities, a slow-motion ambush I hadn't fully appreciated until it was too late. I bought the house in Oak Haven Estates a year after my medical discharge from the Army. After 15 years of living out of a duffel bag, moving from one dusty, dangerous place to another, all I wanted was a piece of land to call my own, a place to sink roots deep into the ground. The house was modest, a single-story ranch with a decent-sized backyard that backed up to a small patch of woods. It was perfect. The HOA seemed like a minor annoyance, a necessary evil for maintaining property values. I read the bylaws before closing. They seemed standard enough. Lawn maintenance, trash can placement, no unregistered vehicles. I was a disciplined person by nature and training. Following rules was second nature. My first interaction with Karen, the HOA president, was on moving day. She'd rolled up in her golf cart, which she'd christened the Executive Decision, and handed my wife Sarah a 3-ring binder thick enough to stop a small caliber round. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions, she'd announced, her voice dripping with condescension. I suggest you memorize it. Ignorance is not an excuse here. Sarah, ever the diplomat, had thanked her with a strained smile. I just nodded, already sizing Karen up as a classic command and control type, someone who compensated for a lack of real authority in her life by lording over her tiny fiefdom. The first violation notice arrived a week later. My grass was 3.25 inches high in one patch near the driveway. The approved height was a maximum of 3 inches. The notice included a grainy, zoomed-in photograph as evidence. I mowed the lawn that evening. The second notice was for leaving our trash receptacle at the curb until 7 p.m. on trash day. The bylaws stipulated it must be retrieved by 6 p.m. I started setting an alarm on my phone. These were probes, little tests of compliance. I complied, not because I was intimidated, but because my mission was peace. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to build my garden. The garden was my grand project. I spent weeks planning it, sketching layouts, researching companion planting. I built 4 large raised beds, each 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, using untreated cedar planks that I sanded and sealed myself. I filled them with a carefully calibrated mix of topsoil, compost from a local farm, and peat moss. The cost of materials alone was over $2,000. Then came the seeds, sourced from specialty growers across the country. Brandywine tomatoes from Pennsylvania, Japanese long eggplants, heirloom Kyoja beets with their candy cane stripes. This wasn't just planting a few flowers, it was an act of creation. As the first green shoots poked through the dark soil, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in years. The garden thrived. It became a lush, miniature Eden in my backyard. Neighbors would stop by the fence to admire it. Mr. Henderson from 2 doors down, a retired botanist, would offer advice on pruning my indeterminate tomatoes. The young couple next door, the Garcias, often received a basket of whatever was ripe. It was becoming part of the community, a positive landmark. But to Karen, it was an aberration. It was unapproved. It was something she didn't control. The notices started targeting the garden specifically, a citation for unapproved agricultural structures, referring to my beautifully crafted cedar beds. A warning about potential pest harborage because my zucchini plants were so prolific. She even tried to fine me for the bamboo stakes I used as trellises, citing a rule against non-permanent landscape features. I'd attend the monthly HOA meetings to contest these, always calm, always prepared with the relevant bylaw sections that proved my case. I won each time, but each victory only seemed to fuel her rage. She couldn't stand that I knew the rules better than she did, that I wouldn't cower. The final straw, for her, seemed to be the small sign I put up for my farm stand. It was tasteful, professionally made, and fully compliant with the county's home business ordinances. But it represented an independence she couldn't tolerate. The day before she salted my earth, she'd confronted me at the end of my driveway. "This little business of yours is a commercial enterprise, and this is a residential community," she'd hissed, her face flushed. "I won't have it." I simply pointed out that the HOA bylaws had no provision against it, and that I was following all city and county laws. I told her politely but firmly to have a nice day. Her eyes had narrowed into slits, and in them I saw a promise of retribution. I just never imagined it would be so scorched earth literal. Standing there, breathing in the acrid chemical smell of my murdered garden, the fog of shock began to lift, replaced by a cold, familiar clarity. It was the same feeling I'd had on a patrol in Kandahar when a situation went sideways. The sudden, sharp focus that pushes aside all emotion and leaves only the mission. My mission was no longer about growing vegetables. It was about dismantling Karen's reign of terror, piece by methodical piece. I turned to Sarah, who was standing on the patio with tears welling in her eyes. "Go inside," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the anger churning in my gut. "Don't say a word to her. Don't even look at her." Sarah knew that tone. It was my operational voice. She nodded silently and retreated into the house. I ignored Karen's continued taunts, her voice a grating buzz in the background. My first step was documentation. I went into my workshop and retrieved my DSLR camera, the one I used for taking crisp photos of my produce for the farm stand social media. I put on a macro lens. I started at the north end of the first bed, taking a wide shot of the entire devastated plot. Then I moved closer. I photographed the shriveled leaves of a cucumber plant, the way the salt crystals clung to them, like a poisonous frost. I took macro shots of the white powder blanketing the soil, capturing its crystalline structure. I systematically photographed every bed, every plant, from multiple angles, ensuring the timestamps on the digital files were active and correct. I took over 200 photographs, creating an exhaustive visual record of the destruction. Next, evidence collection. I went back to the workshop and pulled out a box of sterile evidence bags I had from a forensic science course I took for fun a few years back. I also grabbed a set of stainless steel soil probes. I put on a pair of nitrile gloves. I was going to do this by the book, leaving no room for her to claim contamination or improper procedure. I divided the garden into a grid, just like a real crime scene. I took a control sample from a patch of lawn several yards away that was untouched, carefully scraping the top layer of soil into a bag and labeling it. Control sample, uncontaminated. Then I moved to the first raised bed. I took a sample from the center, bagging and labeling it. Bed 1, center. I took another from the edge. Bed 1, edge. I repeated this process for all 4 beds, plus a sample from the pathway between them where the salt had been spilled liberally. In total, I collected 9 soil samples, each one double-bagged and meticulously labeled with the date, time, and location. While I worked, I could feel Karen's eyes on me from her window. Let her watch, I thought. Let her see what precision looks like. After the soil samples were secured, I moved on to the next piece of the puzzle, surveillance. A few months ago, after the second or third bogus HOA notice, I had installed a small, motion-activated security camera under the eaves of my roof, angled to cover my backyard and the gate. It wasn't high-end, but it was better than nothing. I went to my office, pulled the memory card, and plugged it into my computer. I scrolled through the footage from the previous night. There was nothing until 2:13 a.m. A motion alert. The video flickered to life. The infrared was grainy, but the image was clear enough. A large figure, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, struggled through my side gate. The figure was carrying 2 large, heavy-looking bags. It was her. The floral muumuu was gone, replaced by dark sweats, but the size, the distinctive waddling gait, it was unmistakably Karen. The camera angle wasn't perfect. It didn't capture her face clearly as she moved into the garden, out of the camera's direct line of sight. But it showed her entering my yard, carrying the means of destruction. And then, 10 minutes later, it captured her leaving, the bags now visibly lighter, almost empty. It wasn't a courtroom-ready smoking gun that showed her pouring the salt, but it placed her at the scene at the exact time of the crime, with motive and opportunity. It was a critical piece of corroborating evidence. My final step for the day was research. I spent the next 3 hours online, not looking for revenge forms, but for accredited soil testing laboratories in my state. I found one, a highly respected agricultural lab at the state university. I read their submission guidelines, downloaded their chain of custody forms, and printed them out. I would send the samples out first thing in the morning. Then I researched the state's criminal code, specifically the statutes for criminal mischief, vandalism, and property damage. I learned that if the value of the damage exceeded a certain threshold, in my state it was $1,000, it escalated from a misdemeanor to a felony. My initial back-of-the-envelope calculation, including the cost of the soil, the cedar beds she might have damaged, the mature plants, and the lost income, was well over $10,000. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore. This was a felony, and I was going to make sure the system treated it as such. I laid everything out on my dining room table. The camera, the labeled soil samples, the chain of custody forms, the printouts of the criminal statutes. It was my battle plan. Sarah came and stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice quiet. I looked at the evidence, a cold, hard knot of resolve in my stomach. "I'm not going to get angry," I said. "I'm going to get organized. And then I'm going to get justice." The next morning, I carefully packaged the soil samples in a cardboard box, filled out the chain of custody forms with the precision of a military report, and drove to the post office to send it via certified mail with tracking. That package was a ticking time bomb, and I had just lit the fuse. My next target was the HOA board itself. I knew it was a long shot, a futile gesture in all likelihood, but it was a necessary step in the process. I needed to exhaust all internal remedies before escalating. I needed to document their official response, or lack thereof, for the record. It would show a pattern of negligence and bias that would be invaluable later. I drafted a formal complaint letter addressed to the board of directors. It was professional, dispassionate, and fact-based. I outlined the incident, the date, and the time. I described the extent of the damage. I stated that I had photographic evidence, surveillance footage showing a person matching the president's description trespassing on my property at the time of the incident, and that I had sent soil samples to a state-certified lab for analysis. I formally requested a hearing at the next board meeting and demanded that the HOA's insurance carrier be notified of a potential major claim for property damage. I didn't accuse Karen directly in the letter. I let the evidence speak for itself, referring only to the individual in the footage. I hand-delivered the letter to the HOA's management company, getting a stamped and dated receipt for my copy. The call for the monthly HOA meeting came a week later. My complaint was on the agenda. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with beige walls and uncomfortable folding chairs. About 20 homeowners were there, the usual mix of retirees and a few younger couples. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat Karen and her two board cronies, a nervous, bird-like woman named Carol who served as secretary, and a gruff, silent man named Bob who was the treasurer. Karen, looking regal and unperturbed in a particularly vibrant purple caftan, called the meeting to order. She ran through the old business with brisk efficiency, her voice radiating authority. Then she got to my item. Next on the agenda, she announced, picking up my letter with two fingers as if it were contaminated, is a complaint from Mr. Miller of Lot 42 regarding some alleged landscaping issues. She set the stage, framing it as a trivial gardening problem. I stood up. My name is John Miller. My property was criminally vandalized, resulting in thousands of dollars in damages. This is not a landscaping issue. I had brought a laptop and a small projector. I had asked for permission to use them, and to my surprise, they had agreed, likely not anticipating what I had prepared. I projected the first image onto the wall, a wide shot of my dead garden. A few gasps rippled through the room. I then clicked through a dozen more photos, showing the scorched plants and the salt-encrusted soil in damning detail. This is what I woke up to last Tuesday morning, I said, my voice steady. As you can see, the damage is total. Then I played the video. My security camera captured this footage at 2:13 a.m. on the night of the incident. The grainy black and white video played on the wall, the large figure entering my gate, the heavy bags, the muffled sounds. I didn't editorialize, I just let it play. I could feel every eye in the room darting between the screen and Karen, who sat rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table. Her face was a mask of indignation, but a flicker of panic was visible in her eyes. "This is an outrageous invasion of privacy," she sputtered when the video ended. "That could be anyone. It's someone who trespassed on my property and destroyed my livelihood," I countered. "I have filed this complaint as per the bylaws. I have evidence of significant damage. I expect the board to take this seriously, to investigate, and to engage our insurance provider." Karen regained her composure, shifting into her familiar bureaucratic stonewalling mode. "The board has reviewed your submission," she said, the word submission dripping with disdain. "The video is inconclusive. The photographs simply show dead plants. It could be a blight. It could be your own incompetence as a gardener for all we know." Carol and Bob nodded dumbly in agreement. As for the soil, Karen continued with a wave of her hand, that's just hearsay until you have a report, which you don't. Therefore, the board finds no credible evidence of wrongdoing by any party, and we consider this matter closed. It was exactly the response I had expected, and I had my own recorder running in my pocket to capture every word. But then she overplayed her hand. In fact, she said, her eyes glinting with malice, the board has decided to counterfine you, Mr. Miller. Your dead garden is now in violation of Article 7, Section 4, which requires all landscaping to be maintained in a healthy and aesthetically pleasing condition. You have 14 days to remove the dead plants and contaminated soil and replace them at your own expense. Failure to comply will result in a daily fine of $100. A low murmur of disbelief went through the room. Even for Karen, this was a new level of audacity, fining the victim for the damage she herself had caused. It was a masterclass in hypocrisy. I just stood there for a moment, letting the sheer absurdity of her statement hang in the air. I looked at the faces of my neighbors. I saw fear, yes, but I also saw anger. I saw Mr. Henderson, his face grim. I saw the Garcias staring at Karen with open contempt. This was the moment the tide began to turn. She wasn't just my enemy anymore. She had declared herself an enemy of basic decency, and she'd done it in front of witnesses. Thank you for your time, I said, packing up my laptop. You've made the board's position perfectly clear. I walked out of that meeting not with a sense of defeat, but with a renewed sense of purpose. She had handed me another weapon, a documented, officially recorded refusal to act, coupled with a retaliatory and unjustifiable fine. My file was getting thicker. The HOA meeting was a public declaration of war, and it galvanized me. Karen had made it clear that the official channels were not just broken, but actively hostile. My strategy had to evolve. I couldn't fight this alone from the inside. I needed to build a coalition from the outside. The next phase of my operation was intelligence gathering and alliance building. I started with the people I already knew were sympathetic. I went to Mr. Henderson's house the next day. He was a widower in his late 70s, a gentle soul whose passion was his immaculate rose garden, a local legend in its own right. I found him carefully deadheading a climbing New Dawn rose. I told him what had happened at the meeting, about the fine Karen had levied against me. He just shook his head slowly, his shoulders slumping. That woman is a poison, son, he said, his voice raspy with age. A few years back, I was on the Architectural Review Committee. I voted against her proposal to have all mailboxes in the neighborhood replaced with a hideously expensive, uniform model she'd picked out. It was a waste of money. 2 weeks later, my prize-winning peace roses, the ones that won the county fair 3 years running, wilted and died overnight. The soil smelled strange, like bleach. He had never been able to prove it, but he knew. He had resigned from the committee and kept his head down ever since. He was afraid of her. I have a video, I told him, and I sent soil samples to a lab. I'm not letting this go. A spark of the old fire returned to his eyes. He gave me a copy of his resignation letter from the committee, which hinted at uncollegial and retaliatory behavior from leadership. Another piece from my file. My next stop was the Garcia family next door. Maria and David were in their early 30s with 2 young kids. They had been on the receiving end of Karen's tyranny for months. Their violation? A brightly colored plastic playset in their backyard. Karen had deemed it aesthetically discordant with the community's naturalistic palette. She had fined them repeatedly, citing a vague rule about yard structures. They were young, just starting out, and the constant fines were a real financial strain. When I told them about my garden in the meeting, Maria's eyes filled with angry tears. She told us we were lowering property values because our children's slide was red, she said, her voice trembling with frustration. We've been trying to fight it, but it feels hopeless. She just makes up the rules as she goes. I showed them the section of the bylaws I had found that specifically exempted children's play equipment under a certain size from architectural review. They had never seen it. Karen had been citing a rule that didn't even apply, counting on their ignorance. They were furious. They gave me copies of all the violation notices and proof of the fines they had paid. Their case was a clear example of financial harm based on a fraudulent interpretation of the rules. The pattern was becoming undeniable. I spent the next week talking to nearly a dozen other homeowners. The stories poured out, a litany of petty abuses. A family fined because their basketball hoop was left out overnight. A woman ordered to remove a memorial bird bath she had installed after her husband passed away. A veteran who was cited for flying a Marine Corps flag, which Karen deemed an unapproved banner. In every case, Karen had weaponized the HOA's dense and often contradictory bylaws to bully, intimidate, and control. Many were too afraid to speak up, but with each conversation, I could feel a shift. My fight was becoming their fight. I created a separate folder for each family, collecting their stories, their documentation, and their contact information. I scanned every bogus violation notice, every threatening letter, every canceled check for an unjust fine. My dining room table began to look like an incident room, with files and papers spread out, a web of Karen's abuse mapped in stark black and white. While I was building this grassroots coalition, I was also conducting a deeper investigation into Karen herself and the HOA's operations. I filed a public records request with the county for all documents related to the Oak Haven Estates HOA, including their articles of incorporation, annual reports, and any past litigation. I also did a deep dive on Karen. I found out she had been the HOA president for 8 consecutive years, largely because no one else wanted the thankless job and she ran unopposed. More tellingly, I found a record of 2 previous civil lawsuits filed against the HOA during her tenure. Both were from homeowners who had been pushed too far, and both had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. She had a history of this, and the HOA's insurance company had paid to make it go away quietly. This was crucial. It meant the insurance carrier was already aware of her being a liability. I also cross-referenced the HOA's budget, which was public record, with the fines she was levying. I discovered a slush fund, vaguely labeled Community Enhancement Projects, that was funded almost entirely by the fines she collected. And what were these projects? The new, expensive mailboxes Mr. Henderson had mentioned. A gaudy new sign at the community entrance. All projects contracted out to a landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law. It wasn't just about power, it was about profit. She was using her position to enrich her family under the guise of improving the community. This was more than just being a bully. This was potentially fraud. The file on my table was no longer just about a salted garden. It was a comprehensive indictment of a corrupt and abusive regime. And the most important piece of evidence, the scientific proof that would tie it all together, was still on its way. 10 days after I sent the soil samples, an official-looking envelope from the State University Agricultural Extension Lab arrived in my mailbox. My heart hammered against my ribs as I carried it inside. This was the moment of truth. I sat down at my dining room table, now the command center for my one-man war, and carefully opened the seal. The report was 6 pages long, dense with chemical terminology, charts, and graphs. I skipped straight to the summary analysis. My eyes scanned the columns of data. The control sample taken from my lawn showed normal, healthy levels of sodium, chloride, and other minerals. Then I looked at the results for bed 1, bed 2, bed 3, and bed 4. The numbers were astronomical. Sodium levels were over 4,000% higher than the control. Chloride levels were even more elevated. The report's conclusion, written in clear, unequivocal language, was devastating. The soil samples from the raised beds exhibit extreme levels of sodium chloride, inconsistent with any natural occurrence or standard agricultural practice. The salinity is at a level that is acutely toxic to most forms of plant life. These findings are consistent with the mass application of a de-icing agent, such as rock salt or halite. It didn't stop there. The final page was a professional assessment I had paid extra for, a remediation plan. It stated that the soil in the beds was completely unsalvageable and would have to be professionally removed and disposed of as contaminated waste. It recommended excavating all 4 beds to a depth of 2 feet, lining them, and refilling them with a new, specially formulated soil mix. It also included an estimate for the replacement of the heirloom plants with mature, nursery-grown equivalents to restore the garden to its previous state of productivity. The total estimated cost for remediation, materials, and labor was a jaw-dropping $61,450. I read the number twice. $61,000. Karen's smug little act of improving the soil's mineral content had a price tag, and it was a felony. I now had the murder weapon, the autopsy report, and a bill for the damages. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to bring in the professionals. I had a name from a fellow veteran in my support group, David Chen, a lawyer who had previously served in the JAG Corps. His firm specialized in property and real estate law, but he had a reputation for being a bulldog, especially when it came to fighting for vets. I called his office and secured a consultation for the following afternoon. I walked into his downtown office carrying a thick accordion file. David was a sharp, no-nonsense man in his late 40s with a military haircut and a direct gaze. He listened intently without interruption as I laid out the entire story, from the first petty fine to the HOA meeting to the soil report. I then opened my file and laid the evidence on his conference table. The high-resolution photographs, the USB drive with the security footage, the signed statements from my neighbors, the copies of their bogus fines, the HOA's financial records highlighting the slush fund, and finally, the lab report. I placed it in the center of the table. He picked up the soil report and read it slowly, his expression growing more grim with each page. He looked at the remediation cost and a low whistle escaped his lips. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen on the table. "She didn't just break the rules, Sergeant Miller," he said, calling me by my old rank. "She broke the law. Several of them." He stood up and walked to a whiteboard on the wall. "Your first instinct might be to sue her civilly. We could absolutely do that. We'd win. But it's slow, and the HOA's insurance would likely just pay it out, and she'd get a slap on the wrist. It wouldn't solve the root problem. It wouldn't remove her from power." He drew a line down the middle of the board. On one side, he wrote civil, and on the other, criminal. "We're going to pursue a criminal route first," he said, tapping the right side of the board. "Criminal mischief in the first degree. The damage is over $1,000, which makes it a Class E felony in this state. The potential penalty is not just fines, but jail time." He explained the strategy. We wouldn't go to the local precinct and file a report with a patrol officer who might dismiss it as a neighborhood squabble. We were going to assemble our evidence into a formal prosecutorial package and request a meeting with a detective in the Property Crimes Division. The key, David explained, is to make it impossible for them to ignore. Cops and prosecutors are overworked. They don't want to get bogged down in HOA drama. "But you," he said, gesturing to the mountain of evidence on the table, "have done 90% of their work for them. You have video placing her at the scene. You have forensic evidence from a state lab proving the chemical agent used. You have a documented history of motive and escalating harassment. You have witness statements establishing a pattern of behavior. And you have a certified dollar amount for the damages that kicks it straight into felony territory." This was the legal trap. Karen thought she was insulated by the HOA's corporate structure and her own petty authority. She was expecting a civil complaint, another letter she could ignore or pass off to the insurance company. She would never in a million years expect a detective to show up at her door with a warrant. Once the criminal charges are filed, David continued, a predatory gleam in his eye, it becomes a matter of public record. The power dynamic shifts entirely. She's no longer the HOA president dealing with a disgruntled resident. She's a criminal defendant. We can then use that leverage to force a global settlement. Restitution, her removal from the board, everything. He laid out the final piece. We also put the HOA's insurance carrier on formal notice. We send them a copy of everything. We tell them they're insured, the HOA is harboring a board president who is committing felonies against residents, and that they have repeatedly failed to act despite being notified. We mention the past lawsuits that were settled. Their legal department will have a full-blown panic attack. They will put immense pressure on the HOA to remove her, immediately to mitigate their own liability. It was a multi-pronged attack, criminal, civil, and administrative, all designed to corner her from every possible angle. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the same feeling of a well-planned operation about to launch. So what's our first move, I asked. David smiled. First move is I draft the letter to the insurance company. Then I call a friend of mine down at the DA's office. And you, Sergeant, get to sit back and watch the fireworks. The following week was a masterclass in strategic patience. David Chen worked with quiet, lethal efficiency. He drafted a blistering letter to the HOA's insurance carrier, a document that was equal parts legal notice and character assassination. It laid out the facts, attached the soil report and remediation estimate, and referenced the prior out-of-court settlements, painting a picture of a board led by Karen that was not just negligent but actively malicious, exposing the carrier to massive liability. He sent it via certified mail. Simultaneously, he packaged my evidence binder, now polished and organized with legal tabs, and used his contacts to bypass the front desk and get it directly into the hands of a senior detective in the county's Economic and Property Crimes Unit, a Detective Harding. David's cover letter framed it perfectly, not as a petty dispute, but as a felony property crime with forensic evidence and a clear suspect. Now we waited for the system to engage. The first sign that the trap had been sprung came not from the police, but from the HOA. I received an urgent, panicked email from Carol, the board secretary. The insurance company had contacted them. Their policy was under immediate review for possible cancellation due to unmanaged risk in a pattern of board-level malfeasance. The letter demanded the immediate suspension of Karen from all duties pending an investigation. The cronyism that had protected Karen was beginning to fracture under external pressure. Carol's email begged me to discuss a resolution before the next board meeting. I forwarded it to David, who replied with a single sentence, "Do not respond." The real fireworks started 2 days later. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my kitchen cleaning the residue from my defunct farm stand sign when a county sheriff's patrol car rolled slowly down our street and parked directly in front of Karen's house. A second unmarked sedan pulled in behind it. Detective Harding, a tall, tired-looking man in a rumpled suit, got out of the sedan, followed by a uniformed deputy. I watched from my window, my heart pounding a steady, triumphant rhythm. This was it. Harding and the deputy walked up Karen's manicured pathway and rang the doorbell. She answered the door, a glass of iced tea in her hand, a look of mild annoyance on her face. She probably assumed they were there about a noise complaint or a lost pet. I saw her speak, likely introducing herself as the HOA president, the source of all authority on the street. Harding said something back, and her posture changed instantly. The smug annoyance evaporated, replaced by confusion. He handed her a piece of paper. I saw her read it, her face turning from pink to a blotchy, pale white. The blustering began. Even from across the street, I could see her hands waving, her head shaking in indignant denial. She was trying to pull rank, to use her HOA president voice on a police detective. It was like watching a chihuahua try to intimidate a grizzly bear. Harding was implacable. He just stood there listening, his expression unreadable. The uniformed deputy stood a step behind him, arms crossed, a silent, imposing presence. The neighborhood was starting to notice. Mrs. Gable from across the street was peering through her blinds. Mr. Henderson was coincidentally trimming the hedges that bordered his front yard, getting a clear view. The Garcia's front door was cracked open. After several minutes of animated gesturing and what I could only imagine were shrill protestations from Karen, Harding said something that made her freeze. He pointed not aggressively but with undeniable authority toward my house. He then pointed down at the ground, at her own perfectly manicured lawn. He was explaining the evidence. He was telling her about the salt, about the lab, about the video. The fight visibly drained out of her. Her shoulders slumped. Her hands fell to her sides. The queen had been checkmated on her own doorstep. The detective spoke for another minute, then handed her another document, likely a summons or a notice to appear for formal questioning, and turned to leave. As he walked back to his car, Karen screamed after him, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and panic. "This is harassment. I am a pillar of this community. You can't do this to me." Detective Harding didn't even turn around. He simply got in his car and drove away, followed by the patrol unit. Karen was left standing in her doorway, exposed and powerless, with the whole neighborhood as her audience. The shield of her petty authority had been shattered by the cold, hard reality of the law. She stumbled back inside and slammed the door. The show was over, but the war had just entered its most public and destructive phase. The sight of a detective at Karen's door was the spark that lit the prairie fire. Within an hour, the neighborhood's private social media group, a page usually reserved for lost cats and recommendations for plumbers, exploded. Did anyone see the police at the HOA president's house? The question posted by a curious neighbor opened the floodgates. Speculation ran wild. Was it about the finances, the landscaping contracts, the endless fines? Guided by David Chen, I made my move. I logged on and crafted a careful, factual post. "To all residents of Oak Haven Estates," I began, "many of you are aware of the recent destruction of my family's garden. After a formal complaint to the HOA board was dismissed and I was counterfined for the damage, I pursued other avenues. I can confirm that the police visit to Ms. Karen Johnson's residence today was in connection with a formal criminal complaint I filed for felony-level criminal mischief and property damage. The complaint is supported by forensic evidence from a state lab and surveillance footage. This was not an HOA matter, it was a crime. For too long, many of us have been subjected to a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and financial exploitation under the current board leadership. It's time for a change." I didn't post the evidence itself. David had advised against that to avoid compromising the criminal case. But the statement alone was a bombshell. It confirmed the worst suspicions and validated the private fears of dozens of residents. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My post was flooded with comments of support. "Thank you for doing this. We stand with you, John." But more importantly, people started sharing their own stories, right there in the open. Mr. Henderson posted about his poison roses. The Garcias posted a photo of the citation for their child's playset. The veteran who was cited for his Marine Corps flag shared his story. One after another, the victims of Karen's tyranny stepped out of the shadows, emboldened by my actions. The social media page transformed from a community bulletin board into a public tribunal. The fear that had kept everyone silent was gone, replaced by a powerful, collective anger. Karen's cronies, Carol and Bob, tried to do damage control. They posted a weak statement about unsubstantiated allegations and respecting the legal process, but they were drowned out. They were captains of a ship that was already halfway to the bottom of the sea. The community uprising was no longer virtual. A clause in the HOA bylaws, one I had discovered during my research, stated that a special meeting of the homeowners could be called if a petition was signed by 25% of the residents. I printed the petition forms. With the help of the Garcias and a few other newly energized neighbors, we went door to door. We didn't need to do much convincing. We had signatures from over 60% of the homeowners within 48 hours. We served the formal notice to the board. A special meeting was to be held in 1 week's time. The agenda, a vote of no confidence in the entire board of directors, and a motion for their immediate removal. The night of the special meeting was unlike any HOA meeting Oak Haven had ever seen. The community clubhouse was packed. People were standing along the walls and spilling out the door. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. Karen, Carol, and Bob sat at the front table, looking beleaguered and pale. Karen tried to seize control from the outset, banging her gavel and demanding order. No one listened. According to the bylaws for a special meeting, a homeowner-appointed moderator ran the proceedings. Mr. Henderson, his voice trembling but firm, took the podium. "This meeting is now in session," he declared. What followed was a public airing of grievances that was brutal in its honesty. One by one, residents stood up and spoke. Maria Garcia, holding copies of her fines, talked about the stress and financial burden of being penalized for having a family. The Marine veteran spoke with quiet fury about being told the flag he served under was an unapproved banner. An elderly woman tearfully described being forced to remove the small stone angel she had placed on her late husband's favorite bench. Each story was a nail in the coffin of Karen's authority. I was the last to speak. I didn't need my projector this time. I just stood before my neighbors and told them the simple truth. "The issue was never about my garden," I said, my voice carrying through the silent room. "It was never about the height of my grass or the color of a child's slide. It was about control. It was about one person's abuse of power to bully her neighbors. A homeowners association is supposed to be about community. It's supposed to protect our shared investment and our quality of life. Under this board, it has become a weapon used against us. We have a chance tonight to take our community back." The final motion was called a vote of no confidence and for the immediate removal of Karen Johnson, Carol Smith, and Bob Jones from the board of directors. It wasn't even close. The hands went up, a forest of them, a near unanimous roar of approval. Karen sat there stunned as her empire crumbled around her in a public forum. She had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. The legal battle was still to come, but she had already lost the war for the hearts and minds of the community she claimed to lead. She was an outcast in her own kingdom. With Karen stripped of her title and publicly disgraced, the legal machinery began to grind forward, unimpeded by her former influence. The district attorney's office formally filed the charges. Criminal mischief in the first degree, a felony. The public outcry and the mountain of evidence I had provided made it an easy decision for them. Karen was now Karen Johnson, criminal defendant. She hired an expensive lawyer who initially tried to bluster his way through, filing motions to dismiss based on neighborhood squabbles and HOA overreach. David Chen swatted them away like flies. The core of the case was the soil report. It was impartial, scientific, and irrefutable. There was no arguing with 4,000% sodium levels. The turning point came during a pretrial conference with the assistant district attorney, a sharp young woman named Ms. Albright. David had arranged for me to be present. Karen and her lawyer were there, sitting across a large conference table. Karen looked haggard. The stress had taken its toll. Her usual defiant glare was replaced by a haunted, hunted look. Ms. Albright laid out the prosecution's case with cold precision. "Ms. Johnson," she said, "we have you on video trespassing. We have a forensic report that is, frankly, unassailable. We have over a dozen witnesses prepared to testify to a clear pattern of harassment and motive. If this goes to trial, you will be convicted. Given the value of the damages, a felony conviction carries a potential sentence of 1 to 3 years in state prison. I suggest you listen very carefully to the offer I'm about to make. The room was silent. The mention of prison time hung in the air, a shocking dose of reality. Karen's lawyer, realizing his client was cornered, shifted his tone from combative to conciliatory. The plea bargain negotiation began. Ms. Albright, guided by a list of demands David and I had prepared, was relentless. The deal she offered was brutal, but just. First, Karen would have to plead guilty to the felony charge. It would be a suspended sentence, meaning no immediate jail time, but she would be a convicted felon on probation for 5 years. Any violation, and she would go straight to prison. Second, she was to pay full and complete restitution for the damages. David presented the official itemized quote from their professional landscaping and soil remediation company. The grand total, $61,450. Karen's lawyer balked, calling the figure outrageous. David calmly produced the company's credentials, the detailed breakdown of costs for hazardous soil disposal, the price of 3 tons of custom-blended organic soil, and the cost of sourcing and planting mature fruit-bearing heirloom vegetable plants. Your client chose to use a chemical agent, David said flatly. This is the cost of cleaning it up. My client will not accept a penny less. Third, and this was my masterstroke, a condition David fought hard for. Karen Johnson was to be permanently and legally barred from ever serving on the board of directors of any homeowners association, co-op, or similar community governance body in the state for life. We were not just removing her from power in Oak Haven, we were ensuring she could never inflict this kind of misery on any other community ever again. Fourth, she was required to attend and complete a 52-week anger management program. Finally, she would have to write a formal letter of apology to me and another to the Oak Haven community to be read aloud at the next homeowners meeting. Karen sat there listening as the terms of her surrender were dictated. Each condition was another brick being removed from the foundation of her life. The felony conviction would make it difficult to find employment. The restitution was a crushing financial blow. The ban from HOA service was a direct assault on her identity, the source of her power and self-worth. I watched her face as her lawyer explained the stark reality. Take the deal or risk prison. I saw the last vestiges of her defiance crumble, replaced by the hollow look of utter defeat. Tears of self-pity streamed down her face, carving tracks through her makeup. She wasn't crying for what she had done to me. She was crying for what she had brought upon herself. After a tense, whispered conference with her lawyer, she nodded weakly. She would take the deal. A month later, we were in a courtroom. It was a formality. Karen stood before the judge, her voice a barely audible whisper as she pleaded guilty to the felony charge. The judge read the terms of the plea agreement into the record. When he got to the restitution amount, a gasp went through the small gallery where Mr. Henderson and the Garcias had come to show support. $61,450, the judge repeated, to be paid in full to the victim, Mr. John Miller. The gavel came down. It was over. The financial fallout for Karen was catastrophic. The restitution, combined with her own legal fees, forced her to sell her house, the very house from which she had ruled her little kingdom. The for sale sign that went up on her lawn was a monument to her downfall, a public symbol of the consequences of her actions. Her reign was not just over, it was being liquidated. The power she had abused had cost her everything. The weeks following Karen's conviction were a time of profound transformation, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. The restitution check, a certified bank draft for the full $61,450, arrived at David Chen's office. He called me to come pick it up. Holding it in my hand was a surreal moment. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about the tangible proof of accountability. It was the physical embodiment of justice. The first thing I did was hire the soil remediation company. A few days later, a large truck and a small bobcat excavator arrived. The work began. It was a strangely cathartic process to watch. The machine dug into my dead garden, scooping out the poison earth, loading it into a dumpster to be hauled away like the toxic waste it was. It was a literal cleansing. As they worked, my neighbors came out. Mr. Henderson brought over a thermos of coffee for the work crew. Maria Garcia walked over with her two kids, who watched the bobcat with wide-eyed wonder. There was no fear on her face, only a relaxed, happy smile. The ugly brown scar on my property was being healed, and it felt like the whole community was part of it. After the contaminated soil was gone, a new truck arrived, this one filled with rich, dark, fragrant earth. The crew filled the cedar beds to the brim with the new soil. It looked and smelled alive. While the physical restoration was underway, the social restoration of Oak Haven was also in full swing. We held an election for a new HOA board. Mr. Henderson, his confidence restored, agreed to run for president. David Garcia, the young father from next door, ran for treasurer, vowing to bring transparency to the budget. A sharp, fair-minded woman who was a retired project manager ran for secretary. They were elected unanimously. Their first act was to schedule a community-wide review of the bylaws, with the stated goal of eliminating vague, arbitrary, and punitive rules, focusing instead on genuine issues of safety and property maintenance. The era of weaponized bureaucracy was over. The final piece of the court order was Karen's letter of apology. At the first meeting of the new board, Mr. Henderson stood at the podium and read it aloud. It was a stilted, lawyer-vetted document, devoid of any real emotion or remorse. But the public humiliation was the point. It was her final, powerless act in the community she had once terrorized. The day the Garden of Restoration was complete, the landscaping foreman handed me the final invoice, marked paid in full. I walked out to my backyard and stood before the 4 raised beds, now filled with pristine soil. The air was clean. The oppressive weight that had hung over this space was gone. The next morning, I didn't sleep in. I woke up early, just as the sun was rising. I went to my workshop and retrieved the small box of leftover heirloom seeds from the previous season. I took a packet of Brandywine tomato seeds and walked out to the new garden. The soil was cool and soft under my fingers. I pushed a single seed into the center of the first bed, into the heart of the reclaimed earth. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. It was the final confrontation, not with Karen, but with the violation she had inflicted. It was a declaration that life would return, that my peace would not be stolen, that roots could and would grow again, even in a place that had been salted. Sarah came out and stood beside me, her hand in mine. We looked at the freshly prepared beds, a blank canvas of dark soil against the green of the lawn. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was a symbol. It represented the resilience of a community, the power of methodical persistence, and the simple, profound truth that justice, like a well-tended garden, can be cultivated even in the most toxic of environments. A few weeks later, tiny green shoots began to push their way up through the soil. Life was returning. Around the same time, a moving truck pulled up to Karen's old house. A new family, young and full of hope, moved in. I watched them unload their boxes, and I made a mental note to bring them a basket of the first ripe tomatoes. The cycle was complete. The poison had been purged, and the community was healing, growing stronger and more connected than ever before. My fight was over, and the peace I had fought for, both overseas and in my own backyard, was finally truly my own.